Hello everyone, and welcome to today's side event and our panel discussion, Torture and Accountability, Justice and Accountability for Torture in the UAE. My name is Ramzi Kaiss. I have the pleasure of moderating this discussion, and I am a legal and policy officer at MENA Rights Group, which is a Geneva-based legal advocacy NGO defending and promoting fundamental rights and freedoms in the Middle East and North Africa region. Thank you to the International Institute for Rights and Development for hosting us in this room. As you can see, we're joined today by a panel of human rights defenders, lawyers, activists, and families of activists who in many ways are linked by the experiences or the consequences of torture in the UAE. In this panel, we hope to shed light on the practice of torture in the UAE, but to also gain insight into possible avenues for justice and accountability for such practices. On its part, MENA Rights Group has been involved in documenting torture across various countries in the MENA region, including the United Arab Emirates. And in our work on the UAE, we have found that the UAE authorities, including and particularly the state security apparatus, have been responsible for a widespread pattern of human rights violations, including arbitrary arrest and detention, enforced disappearances, and torture, and most notably against government critics, political opposition figures, and human rights defenders. Indeed, dating back to at least the Arab Spring, the UAE has increasingly begun to crack down on dissent and enacted a legal framework that criminalizes the exercise of fundamental freedoms, especially freedom of expression and assembly, association, and the right to receive and communicate information and ideas. And this crackdown came along the introduction of a repressive legal framework, including the introduction of a cybercrime law and a counterterrorism law, in addition to a previous state security law. So together, the vague provisions included in this legislation have provided the condition for the arbitrary arrest and detention of human rights defenders, lawyers, activists, and journalists. And the absence of legal safeguards guaranteeing the rights of those arrested, torture has become widespread. Indeed, the Emirati legal system does not provide sufficient safeguards to prevent the practice of torture against those detained, and in practice, even existing legal guarantees are not respected. Time limits imposed on custody, for example, do not apply to cases falling under the state security law, which grants the presidency of the state security apparatus the authority to order the detention of suspects for up to 60 days, which can be renewed for another 30 days before they are brought before the state security prosecution. Now, despite the United Arab Emirates' ratification of the UN Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment in 2012, the practice of torture remains widespread. This past July, the UN Committee Against Torture reviewed the United Arab Emirates' implementation of the provisions of the UN CAT, the Convention Against Torture, for the first time. And in its concluding observation, the committee noted with concern the lack of a definition of torture within the UAE's legislation that conforms with Article 1 of the UN CAT, and also highlighted the lack of legal provisions establishing that no exceptional circumstances may be invoked as justification for the practice of torture. The committee also noted that it received reports that detail a pattern of torture and ill-treatment against human rights defenders, activists, and individuals accused of terrorism or state security-based crimes, state security-related crimes. It also received reports that confessions obtained under torture were used as main evidence to convict and sentence individuals. MENA Rights Group, on its part, has also documented a pattern in which human rights defenders and critics arrested based on vague and overbroad terrorism, state security, and cybercrime provisions have been the violations that they've been subjected to. Typically, individuals who are exercising their right to freedom of opinion or expression in a matter that is perhaps deemed to be critical of the authorities are arrested by state security agents without being presented with an arrest warrant or justification for their arrest. Those arrested are brought to a secret detention center where they are subjected to enforced disappearance for periods ranging from weeks to several months. And during this period, they're exposed to torture as a way of extracting self-incriminating confessions. Detained individuals will often only reappear in order to be charged and put on trial. The state security prosecution typically then presents those arrested, typically for exercise as a result of the exercise of their right to freedom of expression or opinion in perhaps opposition to the authorities, presents them with vague state security or terrorism-related charges, and once charged, individuals are brought before the state security chamber at the Abu Dhabi Federal Court of Appeal, often relying on torture-tainted confessions to convict them. And convictions by the Abu Dhabi court may only be appealed to the state security chamber of the Federal Supreme Court, a court which cannot be considered independent or impartial as a consequence of the undue influence of the executive branch on the appointment of judges. And today, in light of what is happening to the UAE 94 detainees, we see that even after individuals complete their sentences, the state security prosecution may request that those arrested on state security or terrorism-related charges remain detained indefinitely under the Munasaha counseling program. This situation in the UAE is further complicated by the lack of accountability and justice for the victims of torture. Those subjected to torture are often provided with no recourse to hold their perpetrators accountable or to seek reparations for the harm damaged. Confessions before Emirati courts about the torture experienced by the detainees are routinely ignored by the judges. Given the lack of effective domestic remedies, today's question becomes extremely relevant. How may we seek justice and accountability for torture crimes in the UAE? This is something that this panel will try to tackle. I hope my introductory remarks give you a brief overview of the practice and patterns of torture in the UAE, and I hope that we can now hear from our panelists to hear their testimonies and their interventions. First off, I will give the floor to Jenan Al-Marzooqi, who couldn't be with us today. Jenan is an Emirati human rights activist, and she is the daughter of the well-known Emirati prisoner of conscience, Abdulsalam Mohammed Darwish Al-Marzooqi, who has suffered torture and abuse at the hands of the UAE authorities. Due to her peaceful human rights activities, Jenan herself has also been targeted by the UAE and has faced threats and online trolling and abuses. She continues to fight for her father's freedoms and human rights for all in the UAE, and she'll be joining us via a pre-recorded video testimony, which we will play now.
UAE. In 2012, the UAE joined the Convention Against Torture. During the same year, they started a massive arrest campaign, and several Emirati intellectuals and human rights defenders were arrested. All detainees were victims of enforced disappearance and were held incommunicado for months. They were subjected to various forms of physical and psychological torture in secret prisons. Detainees who were able to testify during the trials in 2013 mentioned some of the forms of torture they were subjected to, such as keeping them in solitary confinement for months, which means they remained in a windowless cell that is 2 by 3 meters, subjecting them to stadium headlights in their cells 24/7, blindfolding the detainees as soon as they leave the cell and until they return, including when they use the bathroom and during interrogations, keeping them in cells at very low temperatures, cursing, beating, threatening to kill or to harm their family members. They testified that interrogations were taken under torture or threat. More than 31 detainees wrote letters to the Committee Against Torture explaining the torture and cruel treatment they were subjected to. One of them was my father, Abdulsalam Darwish Al-Marzooqi. The first time we saw him after his incarceration, which was about 4 months after his arrest, at this point, we did not have any knowledge of any of the torture he had endured during this time. But his appearance was shocking. Both his psychological and physical well-being was noticeably deteriorating. He had lost more than half of his body weight, appeared pale and in very poor health. We even noticed a bald spot on his beard, which hadn't been there before. During our visit, he kept looking anxiously at the state security officer who was present the entire time. It seemed as though my father felt threatened. Of course, we learned later during testimonies and through the letter he wrote to the Committee Against Torture that he had been subjected to various types of psychological and physical torture. He was threatened with beatings and threats of being killed. He was also denied basic health care. If he did not comply with their demands, they would threaten to cut off his medication. He reported to the judge that before he would be interrogated, they would exhaust him physically and mentally. He would also be forced to sign prosecution documents without him being able to read them. And their reasoning for this was it was the end of their working hours and they didn't have time for him to read them because they needed to leave. My father was deprived of his most basic human rights, including sun exposure, exercising, newspapers, books, papers and pens, and even adequate and clean clothing. He wouldn't even be provided warm clothing in the wintertime. He remained in a secret solitary prison for around 8 months. Although my father complained to the extension judge, who was aware that he was in solitary confinement, about the ill treatment he experienced, the prison conditions, and the torture he was subjected to, none of his statements were considered and all of his complaints were ignored. He tried writing his complaints and he was denied access to papers and pens. If we look at the UAE legal system, we can see that it does not provide sufficient guarantees to prevent torture of detainees, or the authorities do not respect these guarantees in practice. For example, the UAE 2014 anti-terrorism law and the 2003 law of the state security apparatus contains very vague and broad terms that give the state security the discretion to commit serious human rights violations, including torture, enforced disappearance, solitary confinement, and prolonged arbitrary arrest and detention, and particularly against government critiques, political opposition figures, and human rights defenders. Currently, there are 48 prisoners of conscience, including my father, who are being held indefinitely under the pretext that they pose a terrorist threat. There's no criteria or a legal basis for what that means, or a definition for what a terrorist risk means. It is all determined by a subjective opinion of a public prosecutor or a state security officer. This type of detention is considered in international law a form of torture and constitutes a violation of Article 16 of the Convention Against Torture, as it cumulatively leads to serious psychological harm. 10 years my father was sentenced unjustly. For 10 years, he had been subjected to the cruelest treatment and was denied his basic human rights. We've been waiting 10 years for the day we reunite with my father, only for us to wake up to the realization that he might never get released. I call first on the UAE government to release my father immediately. Keeping him beyond his sentence under no legal basis is against humanity and against all international law. My father is not a terrorist, but rather a family reformer. He's considered a pillar in the stability of society and was never and will never pose a threat to it. I look forward to the day all prisoners of conscience in the UAE will get released and get their rights back, and to the day those who are involved in their torture and in violating their human rights get held accountable. And I believe that this will only happen if we work together to fight for what's right. Therefore, I call on the international community, human rights organizations, and OHCHR to stand with us and to pressure the UAE government to release prisoners of conscience and compensate them for all the violations and injustice they have been subjected to. And thank you.
Thank you, Jenan Al-Marzooqi, who's not with us today, for the powerful yet heart-wrenching personal testimony and for shedding light on the legal framework enabling the crackdown on dissent and political activists in the UAE, and also highlighting the nature of the arbitrary arrest and detention of Abdulsalam Mohammed. I'd now like to give the floor to Hamad Al-Shamsi. Hamad is an Emirati human rights defender, and in 2013, together with other members of the group known as the UAE 94, Al-Shamsi was convicted in absentia to 15 years of prison based on vague national security-related charges by the Federal Supreme Court in Abu Dhabi. On September 12, 2021, Al-Shamsi was included in the government's terror list. He's currently living in exile in Turkey, and he is the executive director of the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Center, a non-profit organization that seeks to shed light on the plight of prisoners of conscience detained in Emirati prisons and advocates on their behalf. Hamad, I give you the floor now.
Thank you very much, Ramzi. Thank you very much for having me. First of all, I would like to thank you for having me and give me the opportunity to speak in front of you about this topic. It is a very important topic, and it is a very terrifying one. It is really sad to know that human rights violation and torture became normal in the UAE. Not only normal, but systematic and legal. It became part of the process of detaining the prisoners of conscience. It is important for everyone to know that I am not going to talk about cases of torture, but rather about a systematic torture. And the most terrifying thing is this system has become legal. So we are not talking about cases, but rather about a legal framework that supports torture. If we consider detaining people in secret prison a method of torture, then this act is legal according to the state security law that was published in 2003. This law is a secret law. This law is a secret law. The government confesses the existence of the law but refrain from publishing it. We at EDAC could get a copy of the law and we published it in our website. The only digital copy of the law is available in EDAC website. This law gives the state security apparatus the right to detain people without even notifying the public prosecution office for 90 days. After 90 days, the state security apparatus notify the public prosecution office that this person is in our custody. That means the detention is fine even without the public prosecution warrant, and in facility run by the state security apparatus themselves. Nobody knows the whereabouts of the facility, not even the detainee, not even his family, not even his lawyer. Nobody knows the whereabouts of this facility. In this facility, the detainees being tortured. And we have documented dozens of cases of torture, and of course, it is not possible to talk about all of them, but I will give you one incident of torture in a state security apparatus facility. Ahmed Zahabi. Ahmed Zahabi is a member of UAE 94. He was arrested in March of 2012. And 4 months later, he was interrogated by the public prosecution office, and the prosecutor noticed traces of torture in his body. Just imagine, 4 months later, and the traces of torture still appeared on his body. Ahmed Zahabi is not an isolated case. I'm mentioning him because we have papers from the public prosecution office saying that there were traces of torture in his body. But in reality, every prisoner of conscience has to be held in such facility and has to experience such torture. Dr. Al-Rukn, Dr. Sultan bin Qaid Al-Qasimi, Dr. Al-Zahabi, Ahmed Mansour, and Nasser bin Ghaith are other examples of people being detained in such facility and have subjected to such torture. They were kept in solitary confinement for a month under 24-hour lighting and cold weather. What did the court do when they heard about the torture? Nothing. Nothing at all. They just noted the torture and kept going with the trial without even requesting an investigation on these torture allegations. That means the legal system consisting of the public prosecution office and courts are complices of the crime. We cannot allow the state security apparatus to detain people according to the state security law. This law must be repealed. Keeping people in secret prisons, subject them to physical torture and psychological torture is not only legal method of torture the UAE authority is practicing against the prisoners of conscience. In 2014, they invented the Counseling Center, a rehabilitation law. According to this law, the UAE authority is detaining more than 40 prisoners of conscience beyond their sentences, some of whom has completed his sentence 5 years ago, but he's still in prison. Can you imagine how awful it is to keep people in prison 5 years past their sentence? Because the authority they only think that he needs rehabilitation. This is a way of torture according to a psychologist, Nora Sivas. We interviewed her and asked her about the rehabilitation center, the way the UAE authority is practicing. And she said that this is a way of psychological torture, not only for the detainee himself, but also for his family. The whole family, they are waiting for him and they do not know when he's gonna be released. In fact, there is no rehabilitation centers. The detainees were in a Resina prisons before they completed their sentences, and they still in a Resina prison after they completed their sentences. So the rehabilitation center is only a cover-up for keeping detainees in a prison to infinity. Before I conclude, let me mention some names here. And these names are for prisoners of conscience who has completed their sentence and is still in prison. Abdullah Al-Hulu completed his sentence in 2017, but he's still in prison. Abdullah Al-Hajri, Mahmoud Al-Hosani, Imran Al-Rudwan had completed their sentences in 2019, but they're still in prison. Ahmed Zahabi, Dr. Zahabi, Mohammed Al-Siddiq, Dr. Sultan bin Qaid, and many others has completed their sentences in March 2022, but they still in prison. Dr. Al-Rukn, Dr. Sultan bin Qaid, Dr. Isa Suwaidi, and many others had completed their sentences in July of 2022, 5 months later, 5 months ago, but they still in prison. There are 48 people completed their sentences, but they still in prison. It is hard to imagine that there are people in prisons for years and do not know when they are going to be released, if they are going to be released one day. It is hard for them, and it is hard for their families. Therefore, these rehabilitation centers and the rehabilitation law must be repealed, and the prisoners of conscience must be released. I call upon you to help this cause and advocate for the prisoners of conscience in the UAE. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hamad Shamsi, for your intervention. What I take from what you discussed and what you brought forward is that torture in the UAE is systematic. It's enabled by its laws, particularly the 2003 SSA law, and that other violations accompany torture as well, including arbitrary detention and enforced disappearances, and that the legal system is unable to guarantee the rights of detainees, but in fact enables their indefinite and arbitrary detention beyond the completion of their sentences. Thank you. I will turn now to Tiina Jauhianen, who is a Finnish woman who has been living in Dubai for 17 years when she was forcibly detained in international waters while trying to help her friend, Princess Latifa, escape from her family. She was taken back to the UAE and held incommunicado in a state security facility for around 2 weeks, where she was interrogated every day for hours on end and her life was threatened. She was finally released after a media outcry and has been campaigning to highlight the abuse she suffered in the UAE. Tiina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ramzi. And I would like to thank the organizers as well for the opportunity to be here today and tell my story as well. So I lived in Dubai for 17 years until 2018, when I tried to help my friend, Princess Latifa, at her request, to flee Dubai after she had suffered many years of torture and abuse herself. Some of you may have already read or heard about our escape attempt, and while the story of our escape has been followed very closely, many people forget that I was just an ordinary person trying to help a close friend, as anyone would in that kind of situation, and I ended up suffering greatly for this. I will give you a brief overview of what happened to me and what I am hoping will happen now. It was on the 24th of February 2018 that we left Dubai and drove to Oman, where we were picked up by a yacht that was destined to India. After 8 days at sea, we were around 30 miles from India. The yacht was intercepted and boarded by Indian and UAE special forces. They used some form of stun grenades and smoke to get us out from the cabin located on the lower deck where we were hiding at that time. I was thrown to the floor and my hands were tied behind my back. I was stepped on and found myself in a pool of blood. I was dragged to the outer deck. They kept on pushing me towards the railing. I was told to close my eyes and take my last breath, as they were going to shoot my brain out. I was told several times that I was going to be killed. During all this chaos, Princess Latifa was kidnapped and taken back to UAE. I spent another 6 or 7 days at sea, as the yacht we had used to try and escape was made to return to the UAE. The last 3 days I was moved onto a UAE Navy ship. I and the other people on board were kept tied up or locked inside small spaces, and we were forcibly returned to the UAE. When we arrived on land, I was shortly after driven to the detention facility. I was told that I had committed a serious crime against the ruler of Dubai by assisting his daughter to flee and that nobody knew where I was going to be held and kept. In fact, I asked to speak to the Finnish embassy. I was told that I was in a state security facility and that nobody makes calls from there. My detention itself was very traumatic. I was kept in a freezing cold cell with no windows, and during the next few days I was aggressively interrogated for up to 18 hours a day. I was threatened with death right there at the facility, or when they were feeling kind, a life imprisonment. The treatment I was subjected to was completely inhumane and illegal. Without any access to a lawyer or someone from my consulate, I was interrogated and threatened. I was regularly asked how old my parents were and how would I feel about never seeing them again. In all those days, I was not allowed to call anyone. I was also blindfolded when taken to the interrogation rooms from my cell, and I was made to sign forced confessions in Arabic. I have no idea what was written on those papers. I also had to record a confession video as well, at their request, of course. I was also asked to sign an NDA and threatened again with violent punishment and death if I didn't stay silent. I was finally released about after about 2 weeks of interrogations, threats, and psychological torture in the detention facility. In my opinion, the only reason I was released was because there was increased media attention and people were asking where I was. I do not know what involvement there was from the Finnish government, but they have certainly never reached out to me or offered me any kind of route to find justice for what I was put through. Since my release, I have tirelessly campaigned to both raise awareness about what it is like to be trapped in the UAE's hidden incarceration system and to raise awareness about Princess Latifah's situation. But now it's time for me to fight for justice for what I was put through. Those who kidnapped me and threatened and interrogated me acted with total impunity because they knew there would never be any consequences for their actions. But I have decided that I can no longer ignore this trauma, and they cannot get away with what they did. I have also asked my legal representatives to look into how we can take legal action against the people who did this to me. I'm not planning to stay silent. I will keep raising awareness about the reality of the human rights situation in the UAE. And today my plea to you is that we do not accept the way UAE treats people. The UAE must be held accountable for the countless human rights violations. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Tiina. Thank you for your testimony, which is a live testament of the patterns of abuses that take place and that accompany arrests by the state security apparatus. And thank you also for shedding light on the challenges of seeking accountability and justice for torture crimes. I'd like to now move lastly to Clara Gerard Rodriguez. Clara is an international lawyer and a member of the Paris Bar. She specializes in international criminal law and human rights and represents clients before domestic and regional courts, as well as international jurisdictions and parajudicial mechanisms. Prior to joining the Paris Bar, Clara worked as a legal assistant and case manager on defense and victims teams before the International Criminal Court. Clara, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ramzi. In many situations, like the one we just heard about from the UAE, acts of torture are committed by state officials or people associated with public institutions, such as the police, security forces, justice or prison systems. Under some definitions, and including in the UN Convention on Torture, to legally qualify as torture, acts of violence must be inflicted by a public official at the instigation of public official or with the consent of a public official. With this come the difficulties of seeking justice before the domestic courts of the state where torture was committed, because they are often not able, not willing, or not independent enough to investigate or prosecute crimes committed by state officials. So the question raised is which legal avenues remain available to victims and survivors of torture in such situations, and particularly here today in the UAE. In many countries, victims who see their claims rejected by domestic courts can turn to regional human rights mechanisms to assess whether the home state has failed to comply with their legal obligations to protect them from torture and grant them a real chance for remedies or reparation. This is the case in Europe with the European Court of Human Rights, but also in Africa with the African Commission on Human and People Rights, or in the Americas with the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. But no such supranational court or mechanisms exist which has jurisdiction over the UAE. Alternatively, under some conditions regarding the context, the scale or systematic nature of the crimes, acts of torture may amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity, thus triggering the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. However, since the UAE is not a party to the Rome Statute, the ICC does not have jurisdiction over crimes committed on Emirati territory or by Emirati officials, even when they fit the definitions of crimes under the Rome Statute. We can also leave aside the UN parajudicial mechanisms, such as the UN Special Reporter on Torture, because although they may receive individual complaints or send communications to states and report on human rights violations and allegations of torture, they may not enter binding judicial decisions, which will bind on the states and provide victims with effective remedies or reparations. So this leaves us with just one last set of legal avenues for victims and survivors of torture committed in the UAE, which are the domestic courts of foreign nations. Indeed, foreign courts may be competent to investigate, prosecute, and try acts of torture committed abroad through a mechanism known as universal jurisdiction. States that pass universal jurisdiction laws, which are mostly in Europe, with, for example, France, Germany, Switzerland, or Belgium, but also the United States or Argentina in South America, granted their own national courts with jurisdiction over international crimes committed in a foreign country by foreign nationals against foreign victims. This means that, for example, French or German courts could be competent to judge on acts of torture committed in the UAE by Emirati officials against Emirati or foreign victims, even when there is no link or connection with France or Germany. The idea behind these laws is that some crimes are just too grave to go unpunished and become of concern for all of humanity. They are therefore mainly, if not only, triggered when the courts that would be most competent to try the perpetrators, which are the courts of the countries where the crime happened, are not able or not willing to do so. Under such universal jurisdiction mechanisms, several countries may be competent to open cases on allegations of torture committed in the UAE, conduct investigations, identify perpetrators, initiate prosecutions, hold criminal trials, enter conviction, and eventually grant reparations to victims under their own national legal order. It's under such law that in May 2022, a judicial investigation was opened in France following a complaint filed against the newly elected Interpol president, Ahmed Zahabi, for complicity in acts of torture and arbitrary detention committed in the UAE against British nationals. The investigation is currently ongoing in Paris under the supervision of an investigating judge and at the request of the National Anti-Terrorism Prosecutor's Office, which also has jurisdiction over international crimes. However, it must be stressed that universal jurisdiction laws, although very helpful for victims of international crimes, remain largely imperfect and often, if not always, comes with procedural obstacles, making them very difficult to trigger. In France, for example, the individual accused of torture must be present on French soil when the case is opened for French courts to have jurisdiction. This leaves victims with sometimes a very narrow window to file their complaints because, for example, if they know that the perpetrator is traveling to France, he may just stay for a couple of days. They will have to file a complaint within this time frame. It also means that victims must identify perpetrators themselves and monitor their travel, which should not fall onto them. Matters of immunities also often come into play and may shield person most responsible from prosecution, with sometimes also differences in how immunities law are applied between European states. Because of such obstacles, many complaints are rejected even before being examined on the merits, leaving victims with no other options but to turn to another foreign court or wait for a change in circumstances before seeking justice. Lastly, but very importantly, the means allocated to domestic courts and domestic justice systems remain very limited and subject to budget cuts, and too often conditioned on the cooperation of foreign institutions to conduct investigations. For example, a French investigating judge may not just travel to the UAE to conduct investigations, but they must first seek the authorization of Emirati authorities, which they just may never get. Under these conditions, civil society organizations and individuals remain critical for the pursuit of justice. This can be done by conducting investigations and compiling evidence, which may then be filed before court, which a lot of NGOs are doing, but also simply by lobbying or applying pressure on government and national representations to increase the scope of universal jurisdiction laws, as well as the means available to the justice system. And this is something that all of us and all of you here today who are based in Western countries can do. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clara, for your intervention and for shedding light on the legal avenues available to victims of torture at the regional and the international level, and also on the challenges to pursuing these avenues, such as immunity of the perpetrators, the location of the perpetrators, but you also highlighted the roles that domestic courts of foreign countries may play in seeking accountability and justice for torture committed not only for citizens of this country, but Emirati citizens as well. Thank you. Before I open up the floor to questions from the audience and even a couple of questions from me, I'd just like to maybe see if any of the panelists would like to comment on what they heard. If there's anything they'd like to add before we move on to questions? No. So one question I have to the panelists, and this is feel free anyone to take up this question, which is what changes need to take place at the local and or the international level in order to ensure or promote accountability for torture practices in the UAE?
Can I take it?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think on the local level, the problem that we are facing currently, that these kind of torture are legal torture and they are according to the law. In UAE, you cannot go to the court and say that you have been tortured or you have been held in secret prisons, because this is according to the law, and they are not, they are fine with it. On the international level, I believe that raising awareness and keeping people aware of the situation inside the UAE is a must. We currently have a lot of prisoners of conscience. Torture is being practiced as we speak currently. And even though the UAE government being rewarded in a way, they are a member of a Human Rights Council. You cannot imagine being like practicing torture against your own citizen and you're still a member of the Human Rights Council. You're being rewarded by being elected for Interpol, for example. Just 2 weeks ago, Mr. Al-Dhanhani, he the public prosecutor office in the state security apparatus. He has been rewarded and he has been elected for like a certain association in the region. These kind of actions will let the government continue the torture that they are practicing.
Maybe if I may, to bounce on that, the difficulty when the crime or the acts that are committed are legal in the country where they are committed, may also create an obstacle to prosecute those acts abroad, and especially under universal jurisdiction law. Because we see that, for example, in France, there is a criteria called dual incrimination, which means that for French courts to be competent to try on a criminal act, this act must be criminal in both France and in the country where they were committed. So this is an obstacle, for example, that a lot of NGOs and advocates in France have been calling on the government to lift to increase the scope of universal jurisdiction laws. And this is a kind of thing that civil society organizations or NGO can just apply pressure on governments or call on for them to change the laws in their national countries to make sure that crimes are prosecuted even when they are considered legal in the country where they are committed.
Thank you, Clara and Hamad. Hamad, I take from you that the two obstacles, or some of the obstacles, are or maybe what needs to be done at the local level is the criminalization of torture in law and practice, and advocacy awareness at the international level. And from Clara, the complexity of getting accountability for torture. Now, I think I may be wrong, but I believe that torture is criminalized in the UAE's laws, but there isn't an absolute prohibition on torture in the sense that it doesn't state, the law doesn't state that there is no justification that can may be invoked as a justification for torture, which leaves open the question about whether it could be, taken at the international level. And last question from me before opening up to the audience is just, given that we have a crowd here, also what role can individuals or organizations outside the UAE play in pushing for accountability and justice for torture crimes? And I invite the panelists to answer the question.
Yeah, let me. A lot of people have been detained in the UAE from different countries. I mean, we have people being detained from Libya, from Egypt, from Yemen, from UK, from like different parts of the world. These people they had the opportunity to leave these prisons and be outside the UAE. Unfortunately, people being detained, like citizens being detained inside the UAE, they do not have the opportunity to leave the prisons. And if they had the chance to leave the prisons, they would not have the chance to speak up. So I call upon all individuals, who have been left the UAE, like people from outside, and they have been practiced, they have been subjected to torture, to speak up, not to be silent, because when you speak up, when you talk about the torture that you have been subjected to while you were in the UAE secret prisons, you will help someone inside the prison currently. So keep talking outside about the situation in front of the Human Rights Council, in front of the media, in front of your own government will help someone inside. And I think helping someone inside worth talking about the situation that you have been subjected to.
Thank you, Hamad, for that answer. I'll open the question now. I think we have about 15 minutes left before we would need to leave the room. So we have a question in the front.
Good morning. I don't speak very well English. I am Ghalia Jimi from Western Sahara, occupied territory. I like speak in Arabic, and my colleague translates me. في بادئ الأمر أشد على يد كل الضحايا. أشكر الأخ محمد شمسي على مداخلته وعلى كل البانيليست. أشد على إيد السيدة دينا، أشكرها على شجاعتها وعلى المحاولة الكبيرة التي ساعدت بها الأميرة لطيفة، لأني أنا ضحية اختفاء قسري، ناجية من الاختفاء القسري بعد 3 سنوات و7 أشهر من الاختفاء القسري في عهد الحسن الثاني ما بين 87 إلى 91. ومن ذلك الوقت إلى الآن وأنا أناضل وأنا أتحدث، كما أؤكد على ما قاله الأخ محمد شمسي على أنه يجب الحديث بصوت مرتفع عن هذه الظواهر، عن الإفلات من العقاب، عن التعذيب الممنهج. ليست فقط حالات تعذيب، لدينا مجموعة من المعتقلين السياسيين معتقلي الرأي تحت الاحتلال المغربي في عهد محمد السادس يعانون أصناف التعذيب الممنهج، ليست فقط حالات تعذيب وإنما تعذيب ممنهج. نحن من مرينا بالاختفاء القسري إلى الآن نعيش تحت المراقبة، تحت الانتقام، تحت التهديد، إلا أنه لدينا من الشجاعة واكتسبناها من معاناتنا بداخل المخابئ السرية، بحيث 3 سنوات و7 أشهر التي مضيت مع مجموعتي كنا معصوبي العينين إلى غاية 4 أيام قبل الإفراج عنا. لباسنا الأول الذي احتجزنا به مضينا به 2 كاملتين، ناهيك عن التصرفات المشينة اللا أخلاقية التي مارست علينا من تحرش جنسي، من تعذيب. ممكن أنا أشعر بما تشعر به دينا وانشغالها عن رفيقتها الأميرة لطيفة، هذا وشعوركم كلكم وشعورنا احنا كلنا على العرب لأننا تفاعلنا مع الفيديو، وأنا شعرت بهذا لأنني عشت التجربة شخصيا. إذن سؤالي، هل بإمكاننا لإضافة لما قال الأخ محمد شمسي، أنا أتحدث هنا في مجلس حقوق الإنسان منذ 2009 إلى غاية الوقت، صار لي 13 سنة آجي كل دورة وأحكي عن هذه الظواهر، إلا أنني لاحظت عن مجلس حقوق الإنسان هو للدول ويساند الدول، لأن دولنا هذه العربية التي احنا عشنا تحتها ولا زلنا نعيش كل هذه الأشكال الرعب والترهيب والتعذيب الممنهج والإفلات من العقاب، هي دول أعضاء في مجلس حقوق الإنسان وطرف في الاتفاقيات التي تحارب هذه الظواهر، إلا أننا لحد الآن لا نرى شيء ملموس، ولكن سنواصل لأننا مؤمنين بالعدالة، مؤمنين بالانتصاف، مؤمنين بالحق، مؤمنين أننا إذا استمرينا نحن في نضالنا في رفع صوتنا الله حينصر الحق في يوم من الأيام. إذن سؤالي، هل بإمكان في وجه هذا تكتل الدول ومصالحهم الاقتصادية والجيوسياسية، هل بإمكاننا نحن كمجتمع مدني أن نتكتل، أن نتشابك مع بعض لنندد بهذه الظواهر؟ وشكرا.
My name is Ghalia Jimi. I'm from the occupied territories of Western Sahara. I just want to express my solidarity and extend a sisterly hand to both of you, Shamsi, and to also Dina, and express my solidarity as you try to support your own friend. I am a victim of enforced disappearance. I disappeared for 3 years between 87 and 91 under prisons by the King Hassan of Morocco. I lived for 3 years in secret prisons. I was blindfolded. I experienced and continue to experience in the occupied territories systematic violations, intimidations, revenge by the Moroccan occupying forces. It's a system that attempts to silence the courage and try to revenge against anyone who stands up against those systematic violations. For almost 2 years, we were in those secret prisons wearing exactly the same clothes. We experienced all sort of torture. We were raped. Very immoral acts. So I feel you, Dina, for your worry about your friend. And I feel, and because I've experienced this, I feel what you are experiencing and what our brothers are experiencing in the Arab countries. So my question for you, I have been coming to the Human Rights Council since 2009 for 13 years. I've been coming to each session. And what I noticed is that the council is made up of states. States support each other, and they support countries that are systematically violating human rights and exercising revenge against people who speak up. And our only option is to continue to fight against this injustice, to continue to tell the truth, to continue to raise our voices and not to be silenced. So my question is, how, in the face of all of this, in the face of the geopolitical and political interest, can we support each other as people who are experiencing these injustices around the world?
There's a question that's come in online, which I think is a good follow-up to that. And it's for Hamad and Tiina. And it says, what would justice look like for you, in your opinion, as people who have suffered?
First of all, thank you very much for sharing your experience as well. I'm very sad to hear about the experience and what you've been through as well. And to answer the question as well, obviously I'm here to talk about what happened to me. I was campaigning for many years for my friend, but like I said earlier, it's time for me now to speak for myself. And I think the only way we can get justice is to continue speaking and obviously take legal actions. You know, these perpetrators who are guilty of all these crimes, you know, against human rights, they need to be brought accountable. They need to be held accountable. So I think the only way we can move forward is to take action.
If I may, also, I think one of the issues that arise from your story that you kindly shared with us, with Tiina and Ahmed's story, is the length and the time that justice takes before it can be served, and how conditioned it can be to political or even geopolitical matters, which raise a legal question of statute of limitations, because under French law, for example, but it's the case in many countries, some crimes do not have any statute of limitations. For example, crimes against humanity, war crimes can be prosecuted, 30, 40, 50 years after they were committed, but it's not the case for torture. And under French law, acts of torture come to term after 20 years, meaning that after 20 years, if no legal action has been initiated, they just cannot be prosecuted anymore before criminal courts. So again, these alert all of us and raise the issue of the need for broader laws, for an increased scope for all these judicial and legal mechanisms, and again for the importance of advocacy work and lobbying work to just keep on pressure on governments, and including Western governments, to just make it easier for people to access justice in these forums.
First of all, I'm really sad to hear your story. I mean, it is really bothering to hear such stories. And in the UAE, we currently also, not only men have been detained, also we have females. We have some women has been detained in such facilities. We have Amin Al-Abduli and we have Mariam Al-Blushi. These two detainees, I mean, maybe this is a good opportunity to speak about them. These two detainees, I mean, they have been sentenced to 5 years because of a tweet, and they were supposed to be released in 2020. But before they were supposed to be released, they leaked some recording about the way they have been subjected. I mean, the torture that they have been subjected to, and because of this recording, the UAE authority extended their detention for 3 extra years. So they're still in detention, even though they have served their previous sentence. And we have also another story of Ali Abdul-Noor. Ali Abdul-Noor died in the prison. I mean, he had cancer, and I mean, there was a lot of calls from the UN, from human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, they called upon the UAE government to release Alia, but they refused to release Alia, and he died in the prison. These stories, I mean, it is really sad to hear such stories. I mean, sometimes we do not feel the story unless it happened to us, or it happened to someone that very close to us. I mean, we wish that this will not happen again, not in your country, not in here, not in everywhere of the world. People deserve to live with dignity, I believe. I mean, going back to the question from online, I think what justice mean to us, or what justice mean to me at least. I mean, I'm not seeking anything for myself, but I think that there are a lot of prisoners of conscience, their families, they have the right to live with their families member, I mean, the detainee. So I think justice for me, at least in the meantime, these prisoners of conscience being released, and this kind of facility prisons, I mean, these secret prisons, they to be closed. I mean, nobody should be held in such facility. Nobody should be held in such, subjected to such torture. I think if that's happened, I mean, I'm really glad and satisfied with that.
Thank you, Hamad. Thank you, Tiina, and thank you, Clara, for your answers. We have time for just one question. I think I saw a hand in the back. We'll take that.
Oh, thank you so much. We really appreciate the presentation you did, and we always say, by the way, my name is Darak and I'm from Western Sahara, and we say always that we resist through we survive through telling our stories. So thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. And I have two questions. The first question is how to prevent or how to mitigate the domestic violence which always happens in the countries, in the kingdoms and Emirates, which always sometimes happens with the family, the royal families and all these things. And also how to prevent this kind of violations, especially that these countries, they have a very strict and a very conservative, let's say, society that there is no independent accountability system to all these violations. I would like to put the question for Mohammed. Sometimes that, is there any kind of independent committee of human rights in Emirates to follow up and to put kind of accountability to the authorities which are the main ones who commit these violations? Or have you ever been, all these committees have been charges of fabrication of charges to them just because they want to expose what happens there, because they always trying to produce to us that Emirates is the platonic world, that nothing happens there. The second question to our lawyer, please. You know that some cases in some countries, especially in Arab countries and Asian countries, are out of the radar of the Human Rights Council and they don't zoom on it, but still violation still happens. Because actually they said that the ones who decide the map of the violations is decided by the 47 countries, the member states. How we can adopt effective mechanism to do kind of independent, systematic accountability to this, because they said that, or there is kind of, there is any alternative to put sanctions on them, because actually sometimes they said these countries are not accountably because of the power that they have. So this made that this council that we have, it becomes a live vest for these powerful countries, and there is no follow-up and there is no sanctions. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the question. We have 2 minutes, then I think we need to leave the room. Actually, 1 minute, so maybe... Okay, so we'll answer the question after, because we have to leave the room, but maybe we can feel free to come up and we can speak together. I just want to take this time, the 30 seconds left, to thank the organizers of this panel discussion, to thank the International Institute for Rights and Democracy, to thank you, Tiina, thank you, Hamad, thank you, Clara, and thank you to the audience joining us here in this room and the audience joining us online. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramzi.